Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 48 from book 5 of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. So remember, we're in the middle of the Gallic Wars, we're in 54 BCE, and at this point in the narrative we've already seen Sabinus and Cotta be attacked. Cicero is still under attack, right, in the land of the Nervi. He's surrounded, he's trying to survive the siege of his fort. In the previous chapters we saw that Caesar has kind of rallied, well, once he figured out that Cicero was in trouble, he's rallied his army, he's gotten a few legions from neighboring camps around him. One of the legions he tried to get, or one of the commanders he tried to get, was Titus Labienus, who's not able to help him out. And at this point, Caesar is marching forward with two legions instead of the three that he would have, but he's going to help Cicero out, right? And that's where we kind of pick up the narrative and finish it off with chapter 48. And I say finish it off because this is where the AP Latin curriculum stops for book 5. Which is what we're kind of tracking in this series. So I would highly encourage you to read the rest of it, right? Whether it's in English, Latin, whatever it might be. But as far as what we're doing for the AP curriculum, this is the last chapter we're going to look at. So we're going to see how this all kind of ties together. Now, before we dive in, a couple things that I always tell you should do. The first thing would be to get the vocab under control. I've said this a million times. There's a lot of good commentaries out there. And these sections, these chapters of book 5 are so famous because of the AP curriculum. You can find a bunch of different resources out there, vocab lists on Quizlet, whatever it might be. Just pull one, study it. This way you have a jump start on the vocab before you dive in, and at least you have a better shot of understanding the Latin. It's really hard to know what's going on if you don't know what the words are. So always start with the vocab. If you want, you could also just pre-read the chapter and make your own list, right? Might be a good idea, however you do it. The other thing that I always recommend is read this aloud. I know I always say it, you don't have a ton of time as an AP Latin student, but try to read this aloud so you can work on your speaking, your pronunciation, and if you can have a classmate read it back to you, you can work on those listening skills. That might be something that unlocks the Latin for you, right? You never want to shut off those parts of your brain and just translate in your head. It's not a great idea. And I know your time is always crunched, right? Because you have very limited time as you're moving through the AP curriculum and there's so much to cover, but it's a really good idea to at least try it. I'll read you the story in these videos, but again, my pronunciation is nothing fantastic. You should really work on it on your own. The last thing that I'd say is when it comes time to actually translating the chapter, what I would recommend you do is do the read and reread method. So read through it, write down any problem areas you have. Then when you're done with the chapter, look it over and try to figure out where you went wrong, right? If it's vocab, that's pretty easy. Just pull up your vocab list and go over it again to see what words you're missing. If it's grammar, it's a little trickier, but there's a lot of really good commentaries out there. The one that I always recommend in my class is the one that Jeffrey Stedman made, which you can find online. He did a great job with it. There's a lot of good resources that'll try to help you with the grammar because it can be tricky. But if you can, just keep doing that, right? Reading and rereading it until you're able to go start to finish in this chapter without needing any help. That's how you know you're ready to move on and you've kind of locked it into your long-term memory. Okay? So if you haven't done that, pause the video. Go work it on your own, right? Practice the vocab, try to read through it, and just use the rest of the video as sort of a double check to make sure that you're on the right track. Okay? So the chapter starts like this. You have Caesar, concilio eius probato, etsi opinione, trium legionum, deectus ad duas rediera. Tamen unum communus salutis auxilium in celeritate poneba. Okay, so you have Caesar. Again, he's talking about himself here. So you have Caesar with his plan having been approved, right? You have the ablative absolute there. So you have concilio probato, right? With the plan being approved. Eius is just his, right? So, he's feeling good about his plan. And you have although, right? Etsi. So although deectus is describing Caesar, the perfect passive participle. So although he's disappointed, dejected is kind of the word you get in English. But although he's disappointed by the thought of 3 legions, right? So he was thinking he was going to have 3, but he only has 2. So he's disappointed by the thought, right? The opinione, the thought of 3 legions. He had returned to 2, ad duas, right? So in other words, he went back to only having 2 legions when he thought he would have 3. Nevertheless, right, so Tamen, nevertheless, he was placing Ponebat, so this is Caesar, he was placing the one auxilium, the one help, right, or source of help, you might say, of communis salutis, of common safety, in celeritate, in speed. So in other words, he's saying, okay, I don't have 3 legions, he's a little disappointed by that, I have 2, but I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to put all the hope of this turning out well, right? The common safety, I'm going to put it in speed. And this is one of his trademarks, right? Using speed over kind of strength of arms, if that makes sense. So there's a couple times you'll see in the Gallic Wars and beyond in the Civil War too, where Caesar will opt for going faster with fewer troops than waiting to have a larger number of troops. So here he's saying he thinks it would be better to show up and surprise the Gauls quickly than wait for getting more troops, right? So he's willing to go with two legions instead of three, because remember Labienus is trapped, right? The Treveri are besieging him. Then it continues. You have Venit magnis itineribus in nerviorum fines. Ibi ex captivis cognoscit, quae apud Ciceronem gerantur, quantoque in periculo res sit. So you have Caesar, right? He comes through or with or by magnis itineribus, by great marches, right? Great journeys. And what this is really referencing are forced marches, right? So he's going faster than he normally would with his legion. And I think when you look up how fast that could be, these forced marches, I've seen, maybe around 30 miles, 25, 30 miles is kind of a forced march. We saw in a previous chapter, he can go 20, right? That's a pretty fast march in its own. He's probably going even faster than that now. And he kind of forced marches into the Finis Nerviorum, the lands of the Nervi, right? The Nervian lands. So he's shown up where Cicero is, right? Remember, Cicero's camp is in the Nervian lands. So Caesar now shows up. Then you have Ibi there, right, in those lands. Cognoscit, he learns ex captivis, he learns from captives, right, captured soldiers. He learns quae apud Ciceronem gerantur, right, what things are going on, right, is kind of one way to do it. Apud Ciceronem, a good translation would probably be in Cicero's camp, right, among Cicero, right, in his camp. So Caesar learns what's going on, the situation, right? He gets more detail about the siege and what he's up against. Okay, so he not only learns what's going on in Cicero's camp, but he also learns quantoque in periculo, right, in how great of danger the situation is. So he's sitting here and he's hearing from the captives he had, and he's learning that there's a pretty big problem, right, and exactly how much danger there is, and this is going to help him plan, right, his next move, so he knows how to face it. Then you go to the next line. And you have tum quidam ex equitibus Gallis magnis primis persuadet uti ad Ciceronem epistolam deferat. Hanc Graecis conscriptam, literis mitit ne intercepta epistola nostra ab hostibus consilia cognoscantur. Right, cognoscantur again at the end. So you start with then, right? So in other words, he's just heard from the captives what's going on. So then what he does is he persuades, right? Remember, persuades goes with a dative. So who does he persuade? He persuades quidam, right? A certain person, a certain man. And this man is ex equitibus Gallis, right? From the Gallic cavalry. And again, we've kind of spoken about this before. Caesar's cavalry in the Gallic Wars tends to be Gallic cavalry, right? Sort of like mercenary or local cavalry. He doesn't often have Roman cavalry with him, right? Cavalry is not always the Roman strong suit. And the Gauls are really good horsemen. So when he takes over parts of Gauls and makes alliances, he always pulls troops as part of the agreement, right? The troops are going to fight in his army, and often he's looking for cavalry, right? Whether it's Gallic cavalry, later on German cavalry, right? He's always looking for local cavalry. So that's what he pulls out. He pulls a Gallic man, is the idea, right? So it's this certain man from the Gallic cavalry, and he persuades him magnis primis, right, with great rewards. So he's promising this guy a lot of rewards because he's about to do something very different, very dangerous and difficult, right? So he persuades this man that he might carry an epistolam, a letter, ad Ciceronem, to Cicero, right? So he's telling this cavalryman, hey, if you can get kind of behind enemy lines and give a letter to Cicero and make it out alive, I'll give you a lot of great rewards. And we've seen this idea in previous chapters of rewarding the messenger. If you make it out alive, right, you'll get these great rewards because it is a dangerous thing to be doing. So then you have the description of the letter, right? So the Hanc here is talking about the epistolon, the letter. So this, having been written with Graecis literis, with Greek letters, mitit, he sends. So Caesar sends this, meaning this letter, having been written in Greek letters, right? So this is kind of an interesting side note we'll talk about in a second, but it's a little bit, I mean, unless there's a better explanation, maybe one of you can put in the comments below. When I read this as with Greek letters, it sounds like he's writing in Greek, right, to me. Because again, remember, upper class educated Romans, which his commanders probably would have been, they learn Greek, right? So they learn Greek and Latin. So to write in Greek is a clever idea, right? Because the Gauls aren't going to be able to understand it. I've also seen in some commentaries people say it could have also been writing Latin with Greek letters, which I don't know. It doesn't feel right to me. Maybe I'm just not, I've never heard of this. But I would probably say this is Caesar writing in Greek instead of Latin, and you're going to see why in a second. But either way, he writes this letter with Greek letters, right? Is what he does, and he does it so that, and the ne here is setting up the negative, right? So that and again, it's just a negative purpose clause. It says something may not happen is really what's going on, but it's so that with the letter having been intercepted. So in other words, if this letter gets intercepted by the enemy, nostra consilia, our plans may not be known. Cognoscantor is where the ne is coming back in, so that they may not be known by the enemy, ab hostibus, right? So the idea here is, if the letter gets intercepted, which is a common problem, right? You might send a letter and someone grabs it. There are Gauls who speak Latin, right? So they've had enough interactions with the Romans. Caesar's been there for a few years now. There's people who would be able to read his letter. So to hide the contents of his letter, he sends it with Greek letters, right? Using Greek, which is really, really clever. And just as a quick side note, if you want to learn more about this, I talked about it in one of my videos, the Caesar cipher, which is not quite this, but it's on the same track. Caesar was big into using different codes, right? And so you see things about, the Caesar cipher is kind of his famous one, where you write something and maybe you wrap it around a spear or a stick, and it changes the orientation of the letters, and you have to do shifts, right? So like a right 3 shift or a left 2 shift, and different letters get moved, and you end up with a new message, right? If you're interested in this type of stuff, I'd highly recommend you look it up. You can watch my video, or you could just dive into kind of Caesar's cryptography. He was big in this, right? So it gives you an interesting glimpse into kind of like military strategy and spies. And even in the ancient world, there's this problem where you don't want people intercepting your messages, so you have to kind of code them, right? And that's something that we still do today. So just an interesting kind of side note: Caesar writes his message to Cicero in Greek so that it won't be intercepted. Okay. Then we get to the next line, and you have si adire non possit monet ut tragulam cum epistola ad amentum, right? Ad amentum, delegata intra munitionem castrorum abiciat, right? So and he's talking about the messenger now. So he says, if he is not able to approach, meaning to approach the camp, right? He advises, meaning Caesar advises the messenger that he should throw, right? Abiciat, he should throw a tragulam, a spear. And he describes the spear. So it's a spear with the letter having been delegata, having been tied up ad amentum, to the strap, or to the leather strap. So the image we're getting here is that there's a spear, and they've used a piece of probably leather, right, the strap of the spear, and tied the letter to it. So in other words, the letter is now tied to the spear. This again is kind of an interesting element in the narrative, because I believe I've seen another thing that Caesar would do is to, there's kind of two ways to say it. He's either saying take the letter and tie it to the spear, right? So in other words, there's a strap hanging and a letter on the end of it. That doesn't seem like a great idea to me. Another way I think that kind of makes sense would be to take the letter, wrap it around the spear, and then cover it with the leather strap so that you can't see the letter, right? I'm not entirely sure which one is happening here, but one way or another, he's hiding the letter in the spear, which is just another cool use of kind of like secrecy and spies and things like this. But the idea is he should throw it intra munitionem castrorum, inside the walls of the camp, right? So the messenger is going to run up. He has the spear with somehow the letter attached. He's going to chuck it over the wall. It'll land, and everyone will be able to find the letter, and Cicero will know what's going on, right? And what's what the plan is, and that Caesar's on his way. So again, a little interesting. And if you're interested in this type of stuff, I'd encourage you to look it up. You can read a little more about kind of ancient cryptography and things like that. Okay. Then we continue to the next line. So you have in literi scribit se cum legionibus profectum celeriter ad fore. Hortator ut pristinam virtutem retineat. Gallus periculum veritus ut erat praeceptum tragulam mite. Okay, so you have in literis, in the letter, right? He writes, meaning Caesar writes that. Okay, so we have the indirect statement here. He writes that he, with his legions, right, will be present. So ad fore there is where you're getting the will be present part. And we've seen this before. Ad fore is the alternative of ad futurum esse, right? It's the future infinitive of ad sum. So you want to translate it that he will be present is kind of the way you want to do it. And then you have carlater, quickly. So having departed quickly, he will be there. He will be present, right? I guess, or you could say he will be present quickly. But either way, he's telling Cicero that he's on his way. He's got the legions. He's already departed, and he'll be there right away. And he hortator, so Caesar urges him, meaning Cicero, that he may retineat, right? He might retain his pristinam virtutem, his previous virtue, right? So in other words, keep doing what you're doing. You know, you're being very virtuous. You're holding off. Hold off a little while longer because I'm on my way. Okay. Then you have Gallus periculum veritus, right? So the Gaul, right? Remember the cavalryman who's carrying the message is a Gaul. The Gaul, fearing danger, right? Veritus periculum. So he's starting to fear this danger. He throws mitit. He throws the tragulam. He throws the spear. Then you have ut erat praeceptum, and again, notice it's praeceptum, not praeceptus. So it's not saying as he was, as he had been instructed. It's as it had been instructed, right? The impersonal. We saw this in the previous chapter too, where Caesar's using the praeceptum, right? The ending in this case, to say as it had been instructed, as opposed to he was. But either way, so as it was instructed, toss the spear, and he does. He throws the spear and he tries to get it over the walls. Then we continue on, and you have haec casu ad turim ad haesit, neque ab nostris biduo anima adversa tertio die a quoda milite conspicitur, dempta ad Ciceronem defertur. Okay, so you have this, meaning the spear, right? So remember, he just walked up and chucked a spear. So this spear, ad haesit, it sticks, casu, by chance, ad turum, to the tower or to the turret. So remember, they've built the fort. The fort has different kind of turrets and towers on it. So the cavalryman, the Gaul, runs up and chucks it, but it doesn't make it over the wall. Instead, it sticks into the wooden turret, which is just bad luck, right? Casu, by chance, right? So we have some bad luck. And it was not noticed. So animad versa is still referring back to the spear hike, right? So not having been noticed by our men, ab nostris, right? Remember, imply men, our soldiers, biduo, for 2 days, right? So not having been noticed for 2 days, tertio die, so on the third day, conspicitur a quoda milite, it is seen, it's caught sight of by a certain soldier, by some soldier, right? So some really bad luck here that for 3 days, or 2 days, I guess, and on the third day, Cicero has no idea that Caesar's coming, right? Or that his message was received, because the spear is sticking in the side of the fort. No one's able to read it, right? But once they see it, and again, I guess maybe this goes into the idea of the letter hanging off. So maybe I'm correcting myself here. If there's a spear stuck in the tower, why would you bother pulling it down unless you saw something on it? So I guess they must have seen there's a letter sticking out of it. But either way, the letter, dempta, right, having been taken down, it's defertor ad Ciceronem. It's carried away or carried off to Cicero. So one way or another, they see this spear, it catches their attention. I guess there's a letter hanging off it, and they bring it to Cicero because they realize that there's a message being sent, right? Then you go on to the last part here of the chapter. You have ille per lectam in conventu militum recitat maximaque omnes laetitia adficit. Tum fumi incendiorum proco videbantur, quae res omnem dubitationem adventus legionem expulit. So you have he, meaning Cicero, so that one, he. And it's per lectam, so having kind of read, or I guess thoroughly read, the letter, right? That's why it's feminine. It's referring back to the letter. So he recites the letter having been read already. So again, here the Latin is trying to say that the participle is the thing happening first, right? So again, usually we would put like 2 main verbs in English, but Latin likes to use the perfect passive participle to show it already happened. So it's saying, having already read through the letter, he recites it in conventu militum, in an assembly of the soldiers. So the image you want here is Cicero gathers up all his men. He already knows what's in the letter, but he's going to read it aloud to him because this is good news. He knows Caesar's on his way. And it, it affects them. Either the letter affects, or I guess you could say Cicero affects them. And he affects omnes, everyone, maxima laetitia, with the greatest rejoicing. So in other words, all his soldiers hear this, and now they're kind of spirits are buoyed, and they're all back on track because they know that Cicero is going to be there any minute, right? Then you have tum fumi, then the flames, right? It's the flames incendiorum of the fires far off, procul, videbantur, they were seen. So after this happens, they look up and they see the smoke coming from the distance, right? And this is Caesar coming, right? So it's a race, a situation or an affair which, right? You have quae race, so a matter which expels omnem dubitationem, all doubt of the arrival of the legions, adventus legionem. So here they just read Cicero reads the letter saying that Caesar's on his way. They look up and they see fire coming from the direction of where Caesar is, and they understand that this is the legions, right? So the Roman legions are on their way, and they've effectively been saved. Okay, so like I said, this is where we stop with the AP curriculum for book 5. If you want to, you can keep reading it and you'll see kind of what happens. It's worth reading. But this is the end of kind of our section on book 5 for the AP curriculum. So as we go through and think about it, right, there's a couple of things to think about, like I always tell you in these. Nothing too crazy, but this chapter is kind of fun because it gives you a look into like the secrecy, the spy network codes, right, ancient codes. There's a lot you could do here, and I'd encourage you to look up Caesar and different Roman leaders and emperors and how they hid their messages, right? Because there is a concern that someone's going to read it. Definitely worth your time. The other thing is, at the beginning, I always like to point out that Caesar mentions he's disappointed by what happened with Labienus. And again, I'm not sure if he's commenting on his commander, like, I guess I'm disappointed, or it's just more him admitting, that he was expecting more and didn't get it. But it is interesting that he notes that he's disappointed. You don't really see that often. Usually everything with Caesar is like, yeah, I knew this was going to happen. Everything's great. So, I don't know. It's just an interesting kind of side note. But right after that, he also pumps himself up by showing that he's going to put his hope in speed, right, over troop numbers, which is what we were saying before. This is one of his trademarks. The faster you can go, the better it'll be. So he'll often trade having more having more soldiers and having to wait for having fewer soldiers and going fast, right? That's usually the decision he does. It almost always works out for him. Okay. The third thing to kind of notice is that the cavalryman who brings the letter, right, is Gallic. He's a Gaul. And I've said this before, but not all the Gallic tribes are involved in the revolt, and that's something to keep track of. So it's not like all of Gaul is somehow revolting. It's just specific tribes, right, really in Belgium. And again, we said Caesar's a big fan of employing Gallic cavalry to boost up his forces. It's not that uncommon, but it is interesting that he's trusting a Gaul in the middle of a Gallic revolt right against him. Just an interesting side note. And lastly, Cicero, right? His valor, his hope. I think it's interesting to read that last section and realize that the letter never made it to Cicero. So they are really in a tough spot. They're getting crushed. They don't know if any of the messages actually made it to Caesar. They're trying to get help, but on their end, Cicero and his troops have no idea. We've read in previous chapters how they're getting battered. They're really running out of guys and everyone's hurt, right? So to keep fighting without any clue that help is coming is interesting. And again, they didn't even know the letter had made it. His troops are continuing to withstand the siege. So I think one way to read the last part is not only Caesar saving the day, but how valiant Cicero has been, right? Which is kind of a key part of the end of book 5, especially one last time in contrast to Sabinus and Cotta, when we see that they're really not making good decisions. Cicero continues to be this like sort of model Roman commander who's holding out hope, even though he has no hope that any help is coming, right? Because the letter never made it to him. So hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions, again, feel free to put them in the comments below. But otherwise, keep practicing this, keep reading. And like I said, if you're able to go start to finish in this chapter, you can read it without too much trouble. That's how you know you're probably ready to move on. Good luck with it.